Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this debate on innovative China. My name is Kjeld Lawson, and I belong to the Druid Society and CBS as well. And I'm very happy to introduce this thing that we're going to debate today, whether or not China will turn out to become the world's innovative superpower by 2040. We have Marina, we have Ram, we have Daniele, and we have Scott. And they are going to be debating over this motion. Let it be resolved that this conference believes that China will become the leading innovative power in the world in 2040. Now, we also have some rules of the game, as usual in Druid. Basically, we will in a short while we will have a vote just to get an indication what this audience think about the motion, and then we will have 12-minute interventions from each of the team, beginning with the people that speak for the motion, against, and so on and so forth, and then in the end we have 3-minute rebuttals. And before we have the final vote, we will also accept a few questions from the audience towards the panelist. And then we will end off by a final vote. The last thing I have to do is really to vote on this motion. Let it be resolved that this conference believes that China will become the leading innovative power in the world in 2040. So those voting for the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, that's noted. Those voting against the motion? Okay, so there's some work to do for those who are for the motion. But I think we should just start right off and give Marina the first chance to change this picture. So please.
Well, overwhelmingly, the majority actually would vote against our motion. I feel a lot of pressure. Anyway, I try to convince you at the end of the presentation that you should change your vote. And of course, I'm the only Chinese sitting here, and I hope in 2040 there are more Chinese sitting here to fight against those who don't vote for us. So I will talk about three things today. Basically, I try to give you a big picture of why China got a good chance to be an innovative power in 25, 26 years from today. So I'd like to draw your attention to China's historical achievements in science and innovation. And of course, this is perhaps the best known achievements of Chinese ancient scientific achievements. So the paper making, movable print tablets, the campus, and the gunpowder. So you've perhaps seen this in the grand opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympic Games, demonstrated by Chinese art and film director Zhang Yimou. So, but this is only just a tip of the Chinese scientific achievements. In fact, the Cambridge scholar Joseph Needham spent almost his entire life to investigate and document the Chinese historical scientific achievements, and he produced 17 volumes of such results. So. Maybe you don't know what's this. This is the Zhenghe. So in the 15th century, at the beginning of the 15th century, China's fleet, basically Zhenghe led the fleet, made 7 trips to 37 countries. So that is almost 80 years ahead of Columbus. by which, of course, he discovered American continent. So, according to Needham, by then, China actually had the most powerful navy power, more than the combination of all European countries at the time. And of course, Needham also concluded China was the leading innovative power for 2,000 years, all the way before the 16th century. Of course, he asked this very grand question, why China failed to innovate afterwards. And of course, a lot of reasons, cultural reasons, institutional, ideology, you can name a lot. But we just look at the past first. So this is a map, Zheng He's voyage. He made 7 trips to 37 countries. And to put everything in perspective, I want to use this picture to show you. You see in the background, that is the size of a ship Zheng He used and made by Chinese. And in the front, you can see a small boat that is used by Columbus. So, but we can't really live in the past. We have to look forward to the future, right? So, of course, one thing that made me sad is all those achievements actually are not well known outside of China. Why? Because China was an isolated country, was isolated from the rest of the world. Language issues and political issues and a lot of things. A lot of things actually cannot be passed out of China's boundaries. So things are changing today. So the second issue I want to talk about is the development of China's internet. So I want to show you a picture of this. This is a China-made mobile phone. It's called Xiaomi. It's only 3 years old. And it has all functionalities of iPhone 5S, or Samsung S5. Anyway, so the price is 1/5 of an iPhone 5. So this is a typical model of C2B. So we talk about B2B, we talk about C2C, and we don't talk about C2B. So this model is the way that consumer contributes to the innovation of the product. So therefore, that is a community-powered consumer behavior is the source for innovation. So nowadays, innovation, the success of innovation is not entirely about your merits of your technological breakthroughs. It's the speed at which you can ship your products to the users. So this company is leading on that front. So they use this launch, test, and improve model. So they never wait until the product is perfectly, with all the functions. They launch the product when it's halfway baked. And then they leave the products to the consumers and let them to tell the producers what needs to be added and what needs to be improved. And then they quickly ship the second batch. And this is possible because China's consumer market is unique in a way that is, you can't really say China's market has a uniformed mainstream consumer market segment because of geographic differences, because of social, economic status, educational backgrounds, and income levels. All those factors actually make China's consumer market a very complex one and a fast-moving one. So you might say, well, the small group of people in the big cities, and they are the consumers for the most advanced brand products, such as iPhone 5 or Samsung 5S, S5. But a lot of people, consumers in the second tier, third tier, even rural areas, they are expecting something like this, which actually got a modern design and which got almost all functionalities and which can meet their needs and which is cheap. So this is the model. I think that is a challenge for the rest of the world. If you are concerned that China's innovation will grow, is a model you should you should watch for. So why I want to say that? I just want to show you these statistics of China's netizen size and growth. You can see China's internet netizens, internet users started in 1999 with only 8.9 million. And today, by the end of last year, China had 617 million internet users. So, of course, the growth will slow down, no doubt about it. But you can see the volume is really big. It's almost double of the US population. So, mobile netizens. And according to a study made by Oxford Internet Institute, China's netizens are more likely to contribute, to express their ideas online 3 times more than the leading internet countries. So this is called new internet world. And because of the mobile phones produced by Xiaomi, cheap smartphones, so that enabled over 80% of Chinese netizens get online through their mobile devices. So this enabled them to bypass the bottleneck of internet connections on the PC, on the desktops. So, and what they do online? They're discussing about issues, and they talk about their life. They don't really talk about that much about politics, and they seek entertainment channels. American influence is very strong, and so on. And of course, they talk about products. They not just talk about products which one is more desirable, and they also make contributions to how to make improvements on those undesirable. So the Chinese firms, they really have realized and put in use of this crowd wisdom or intelligence. So in the first time, they gather data from the users and they incorporate those feedback into their product design. So according to Peter Williamson, he just got a paper published in the MIT Sloan Management Review. I actually met him yesterday, so gave me the paper and to support my argument. And he put up this concept that is called accelerated innovation. So he said this model actually is making the innovation process industrialized in China. So that enabled Chinese firms to be able to produce low-cost innovation and scale up really fast. So speed really matters in this concept. So collective intelligence, which is, well, in a way, very hard to predict, and which is very complex, but which can contribute to innovation. So the third one I want to talk about is business model innovation. So, and of course, we know China still doesn't have any world brands. Well, a few, but not many, and doesn't really have technological breakthroughs. But because of the globalization, because of the pervasive use of ICT technologies, and most value chains actually are becoming very, very fragmented. So that enables firms with innovative ideas to identify discrepancies and allocate resources and to try to match a supply of and demand for resources, talent, information, capabilities, and so on, to provide the fast and most effective solutions to meet users' needs. So this business model innovation is not like, the Western models, which is efficiency-centered or novelty-centered. They're not that new. They're recombining all different things. But in the end, they provide the most effective solutions to get things, to get the information flow. So in the digital world, digital doesn't respect boundaries, and they can get all different resources and put together, and that enables them to move faster. So I used up my time and finished. Thank you very much. Please vote for us.
Hello. So many thanks to Kel for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here at Druid. And it will be even more pleasure to see all of you next year in Rome, of course. And by the way, I would like to see what the audience will say about the presentation that was presented about the need of punishing for social misbehavior in Rome, not in Copenhagen, in Rome. So maybe, anyhow, I'm here to discuss about China. And I don't think that China will become the superpower of innovation within 25 years for two main reasons. The first is that China is strongly specializing in manufacturing technology, while I think the leadership in innovation will be in another area, in service economy. The second is because I don't think we can extrapolate trends. Trends at a certain point stop, and there is a trend which becomes flat. And China is very much in the growing mood today, but this growing mood cannot continue forever. And as it happened before for other countries, it will slow down. So let me sustain these two things by saying that indeed, in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century especially, we knew very well what was a driving force of innovation. And actually, if I can show it in a very simple way, I would like to compare a science fiction film of the 80s with the contemporary science fiction film, Blade Runner with Transcendence. Both of them have got very handsome actors acting in them. And you can really see the difference. Still, Blade Runner was showing a society in which the driving innovation was based on some artifacts. But nowadays, nobody will expect that the driving innovations will still be based on artifacts, but are more likely to be based on something different: networks, communication, and immaterial issues. And this is very likely to affect China. And if we think what are today the leading innovative firms, for example, we won't think any longer at IBM. I don't think we will even think about Samsung, but we will think about firms which are Facebook, Twitter, or other social networks. And not surprisingly, none of these is based in China. And therefore, it might be that China will have a very successful Samsung, and my colleague Marina has already shown that they are making some good manufacturing products. But these manufacturing products are not necessarily those who are going to lead the example in the future. While I think that the future will be more changes in organization, and actually more flexible in organizations which will allow to respect the rules, but also to break the rules, organizations which will be able to link to cultural innovations. And if this is the future, let me say, I do not see yet that this is likely to be in China. And indeed, the best way in which we can visualize it is a prediction made by Daniel Bell about what he labeled the post-industrial society. And it's very this is one of the predictions which happen to be right, you know. And if we look at what happened in the past, you really see that the primary sector, agriculture and other natural resources, went down in terms of employment, in terms of value added, while the industry had this strange U-reverse shaped. Started to grow very much. That was the Industrial Revolution. But then the post-industrial society is moving away. And we are having less jobs provided by manufacturing and more jobs provided in the service economy. Up to the point that the service economy should be distinguished, and there are law-based service economy and a knowledge-intensive service economy, which apparently is going the place where the innovations of the future are going to occur. And not surprisingly, many advanced countries, including the United States, including European countries, including Japan, are applying what we learned from the product cycle life model And therefore, they started to send away in other countries everything which could be low wages and necessarily not strategically competitive. And this explains why many countries, and of course China first and most importantly, have grown so much in the manufacturing basis. But this, of course, has some weaknesses. And if we look, for example, at the distribution of employment according to the various industrial sectors, you see that China has still the typical distribution of an industrial revolution. And we do not see yet here a post-industrial society. We do not see yet a service society because, first of all, the agricultural sector is still very important and it's going to be difficult within 25 years to absorb this agricultural sector in order to make China a leading innovative power. But also if we look at the service economy doesn't look like high knowledge-intensive services. They are more likely to be the traditional services, and this seems to me to be one major weakness of China. R&D. Of course, we know about R&D. R&D went up in China, and China is becoming more and more a great spender of R&D. But R&D, is that better? Yeah. But R&D is again strongly associated to the manufacturing sector. Not only to the manufacturing sector, is moving also to the service economy, but if you look at the Chinese R&D, is still mostly within manufacturing companies. It's not yet in the service sector, it's not yet in the public sector, which, as we know, is quite important in Europe, in the United States, and also in Japan. And indeed, if we take into account other indicators, such as the global share of commercial knowledge-intensive services, those which are likely to be the driving force of innovation in the future, you see that China is not yet performing that well, and that other countries, mostly the United States and European countries, are maintaining employment and value added in these areas because these are the crucial areas. The National Science Foundation in the United States provided some useful data, and you can really see here the different trends between exports of high-tech products on the one end and exports of knowledge-intensive sectors on the other hand. Look at the difference. In the first case, China is now ahead, even more than the United States, even more than Europe. But is this going to be the future? I think that the future is going to be on the other side. The future is going to be in knowledge-intensive services, and if you look at that, you see that China is not yet exporting those. They are mostly imported by other countries because these countries know what they are going to do, and therefore they are decentralized, what they do not regard as a crucial element. So, we should expect also that, I would expect, I've already seen, and I would expect more graphs in which you will show that China growth rate is exponential. That's fine, but how long can it last? And indeed, we have seen these stories before. We have seen the story back in 1890s when Germany was catching up. We have seen these stories when the Soviet Union was catching up. We have seen these stories when Japan was catching up in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. And what has happened? At a certain point, there was steady growth. You could, as Paul Krugman once said, you could not imagine that all Japanese people would get a PhD. Of course, this is not a sustainable society. And therefore, even in China, which is a much larger population than Japan, at a certain point, we should expect that those which PhDs with qualifications, those who are able to take patents out and so on, will be a part of the population and not all the population. There is something that we have to learn from the logistic curve. The logistic curve has clearly shown that at a certain point, there is steady growth, and I think that this will also happen to China. Let me also say that I see some structural constraints in China. And the structural constraints are several, and which I think made China still a weak country. First of all, so far, only a part of China has managed to catch up. And basically, the experts say that about 1/4 of the population has managed to catch up, and the other 3/4 have not yet. So that's, of course, a great potential. but still is a great limit because China took 25 years to get 1/4 of the population to catch up. How long will it take to get the other 3/4 of the population to catch up? It will take time. And after a certain level, I'm not able to make predictions. And the second issue is aging. We shouldn't forget that, even in Europe. Chinese population is aging, and is aging for a lot of reasons, including the demographic policy carried out for many years until now by the government, with the policy one family, one state, one child. And at a certain point, these will create problems in the next 25 years. Why? Because, for example, you will find that the population in the core force, those who are really innovative, I look here at the young people, do not forget that. People do innovate when they are in between a certain age. Don't look at me for future innovations, you know? And when at a certain point you are above a certain age, it's more difficult to innovate. And therefore the population, the innovative population, is likely to be reduced. And this will create social problems, and not only social problems. Second, as many catching up countries, China got a major income inequality. A surprising income inequality for a communist country. And this income inequality is a weakness. It might create problems. It creates problems in the United States, as Piketty has convincingly shown, but even more in a country which has the initial stage of economic growth. And this, at a certain point, will be a problem. China has a problem with pollution, and again, also the United States have got a lot of problems with pollutions, but there are different stages of economic growth. Finally, China has a lot of corruption. I'm not going to discuss, Keld, here if it's true that Denmark is the less corrupted country of the world, because this will be the argument for another motion. And if you see that Sweden, Norway, and Finland are just above, that may lead to a civil war. But indeed, China has still a lot of corruption. Finally, China is still not democratic. And at a certain point, innovation requires experimentation on new ideas. It requires people to be brave and not to be afraid of political power to stop the ideas to come true. And possibly China will move towards democracy, but this will take a while. And this while, perhaps, will be longer than 25 years. Thank you very much.
What's my name? Yeah. Thanks.
That's mine.
Okay, I'd like to again echo Daniele and thank Peter, Keld, and Mark for this very gracious invitation to come back to Druid and participate in a Druid debate, which is always a very exciting opportunity. So I'm speaking for the motion, let it be resolved that this conference believes that China will become the leading innovative power in the world in 2040. Now, 2040 is a long way from now. We're talking about roughly 25 years. And so what I'm going to show you is a lot of things which are true today. Look at the world, particularly the innovative world, innovative statistics. Marina has sort of given us a really nice historical summary. And Daniele has convinced us that, the most important aspect of the modern economy in terms of innovation is the fact that we're living in a knowledge-intensive world. Knowledge and intangibles are a source of value, and we can both agree on that. So it's wonderful that when one's opponents are saying the same thing as you are. Now, I believe very strongly that you should vote yes on this motion. There is, I think, the data is, I think, extremely powerful and very, very strong. Marina has told you and showed you that the Chinese have historical capacity to be world leaders in innovation. And I think we're living in a world where they are rapidly regaining that position that they held relatively recently. If you look at, first of all, look at income. I mean, as we all know, Chinese income has been growing very fast, but it turns out in the most recent data that it's growing faster than we thought. The International Comparison Program initially thought that Chinese GDP would, on a PPP basis, would overtake the US by 2019, but the most recent data released a few months ago says that it's going to happen by the end of this year. Now, China is obviously an economy in catch-up mode. And we know that, again, here I agree very much with Daniele, that knowledge and intangibles are the source of value, and the Chinese economy is currently engaged in a rapid and aggressive program of catch-up in precisely these intangibles and knowledge-intensive outputs. Now, China's got a very clear plan and vision for actually moving in that direction. So, of course, what Daniel is talking about, a knowledge manufacturing economy, is really the Chinese economy of about 10 or 15 years ago. China has very much moved from a manufacturing economy to a made-in-China economy to currently very much a knowledge economy to, in the very near future, moving towards the basic intangibles that Daniele was talking about, namely design. And I'll show you some numbers that will back this up, that this, in fact, is happening in reality. Now, if we look at R&D spending, we see that of all the major China, first of all, is the #2 R&D spender in the world, and it's the only one that really has the fastest growth trajectory in terms of R&D spending and in terms of real spending. So, so not only is it high, but it's also rising faster than any other major economy. Look at R&D inputs, R&D intensity of China. Again, we see the graph for China is the most positive. But let's look at output. Even at basic scientific output, where you might expect a relatively poor economy like China to lag, we see China has already overtaken Japan in terms of the production of science and engineering articles. I'm going to spend the rest of my time really walking you through a little bit of patent data, since I think this audience would be very familiar with this particular metric of innovation. If you look at Chinese total USPTO, and these are not patents filed in China, these are patents filed in the United States. And if we just look over and these are granted patents, I would add. Over the last, just up to 2005, you look at the graph, it looks almost straight up. We have a nice J curve over there. If you look at the technological classes in which China is growing most rapidly, we see they actually seem to encompass the very areas that Daniele assured us were going to be the industries of the future, namely electronics, computers and communication, and design. Again, I emphasize that. Our numbers show that Chinese design patents are growing very, very fast. Yeah, and China is rapidly becoming a leader in these very soft, intangible areas that are going to be the basis of the future. If we look at patent applications and actuals, again, the graphs are pretty telling. This is, of course, not USPTO data. This is WIPO data, looking at the USPTO, EPO, and the Patent Office of China, Japan, and Korea, altogether, all 5. And we noticed that in 2010, already 4 years ago, China had virtually caught up with the US, and you can see it's poised to surpass Japan, which is the current leader, which is, of course, Japanese numbers, as you can see, are also falling in a secular trend. Now, lest you think that this is all happening in China, and you look at Chinese international patent applications under any metric you want, whether you look at the Patent Cooperation Treaty, whether the Madrid Convention or the Hague Convention, all of them show exactly the same thing. We see an enormously, rapidly growing international patent application pool, indicating that we must remember that Daniele is talking to us about a logistic curve, and of course, I think we all agree that is true. But the important thing to bear in mind is, where is China on the logistic curve? Is China at the top or China at the bottom? And I would argue that given the size of the Chinese population and the Chinese workforce employed, China being engaged in this transition from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy, the potential is in fact just unfolding. And we're likely to see the future, particularly the next 20 to 25 years, of even faster growth, not slower growth, before things actually begin to peak off or taper off. Because ultimately, China, we must remember, is still a very poor economy. This is a very poor economy which is showing tremendous innovative strength. And as China's income rises, that's probably when we should probably think of when per capita income starts getting closer to, say, Denmark, then we might expect tapering to begin. But to expect tapering to begin when there's such a low level of income, I would ask you to consider that really, is that really reasonable? Finally, if you look at the patent filings under the Cooperation Treaty, the most recent data we've got, China is already the #3 economy in the world. So we see that not only is it the #3 economy, but you can see it's also the one with the fastest growth, 15.6% growth rate. So they're clearly growing very, very fast already. So I showed you numbers leading up to 2005, right? Those numbers were the J curve going up, and now I'm showing you numbers of 2013 where it's still going up, and it's still going up pretty fast. 15% looks pretty good to me. Okay, so you might say, well, are these all like itty-bitty little companies, or who's doing the patenting? And if you look at the top PCT applicants, 2 of the companies are Chinese companies. ZTE and Huawei are #2 and #3 in the 2013 list. Remember, this list changes year to year. In 2008, ZTE was the top patent filer in the world, which is again a Chinese company. Already in 2008, the top filer was Chinese. 2 out of the top 10 are Chinese. The top is a Japanese company, Panasonic. So really, this innovation is occurring in major innovation champions. Major innovation champions are appearing on the Chinese landscape. If you look at the Chinese share of global patenting overall, okay, now we have and we see again the share is rising very fast. You see that in many, many areas. China now leads the world in numerous areas, including electrical engineering, instruments, chemistry, mechanical engineering, to name just a few. Now, China not only has the advantage of Chinese companies patenting and innovating at a tremendously fast rate, as we saw in the case of ZTE and Huawei, they also have the advantage of, I think as Marina pointed out, the gigantic domestic market, which is attracting our own companies, Western companies, to go into innovation in China. So if we look at the top automotive companies patenting in China, we see GM Global Tech is the top innovator, top patent in automotive in China in 2010, which says basically our own companies are patenting in China. Our own companies are creating knowledge in China. So China's innovative strength is buttressed not only by its own people, but by our companies as well. And this is not just a Chinese story. This is exactly the story of any innovative powerhouse. We all know, all of us on the panel know that within the US context, some of the top innovating companies are European companies. So the US is an attractive economy to do innovation, and the US innovative strength is buttressed by foreign companies, and the same thing is happening in China. If you look at the raw numbers, we can see that the growth rate in high technology exports. Now, is this innovation translating into products? Yeah, and you can see that for 1992 and 2007, just in that 15-year period, the share of high technology exports from China went from 10% to 30%, with a growth rate of 21.2%. And medium high tech went from 10% to 21%. So in high tech and medium high tech, Chinese exports, the character of Chinese exports, Chinese engagement in the world economy is changing in a very fast way. And of course, my opponents will immediately tell you that, of course, a lot of this is only because China is assembling imports. They import all this stuff, and they assemble it and export it, and that gives you a flawed picture. So let me show you the picture of only what are called non-processing exports. Okay, because obviously you're going to expect that in processing exports, where they are basically putting together stuff from imported components, you're going to expect a lot of high technology exports. So let's focus on the left here, non-processing exports, which are things which are made in China. And here we see the picture is not as great, but it still looks pretty darn good to me. Because, I mean, you've gone from 3.9% to 8.2% in high technology. This is stuff made in China. A growth rate of 22% in high technology only. This was aircraft, pharmaceuticals, office and computing machinery, and so on. If you look at medium high tech, again, we see a growth rate of 24.4% over this 15 period. This is just up to 2007. Okay, so now we think of, I think we have kind of a cliche view of the Chinese economy, is that, well, they make all this low technology stuff, and okay, so, but one thing that China is very good at, has shown us they're very good at, is they're very good at leapfrogging global value chains. So here's the global value chain in a toy where the printed circuit board is made in China. In this toy, which is sold in 2003, 2005. The same PCB, printed circuit board, now is put in the Kindle that you see, that many of you probably have at home or in your briefcase. So China has clearly been able to make the move from toys to electronic devices. So this is one jump, and so we should expect nothing more in the future. So I'm going to conclude with saying, don't take our word for it. Danny Rodriguez said in 2006 that China has somehow managed to latch on to advanced, high productivity products that one would not normally expect a poor labor economy like China to produce, let alone export. So I really think you should vote yes. Thank you.
Okay, how does this? Hello? Does that work? Okay. There we go. Okay, now it's very dramatic. Okay. Okay, well, first, I wanted to thank the organizers and Daniele and Maria and Ram for a great discussion of what I really think is a very, very important issue. I do think that in some sense, right, what we're trying to do here is adjudicate not only, right, will China become the leading innovative power by 2040, but why also I think it's important to think about why we care about that question, what we really think about kind of what we mean by an innovation system, and for a region and a geography to be an innovative power itself. So, you know, I run a program at MIT called the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, and one of the teams that we worked with over the last few years was a group from a stakeholder team from Hangzhou, China, and this was from their presentation. And you know, this is for those of you who don't know, Hangzhou is by far the kind of wealthiest single area in China. It's kind of a suburb of Shanghai. It probably is quite beautiful. It's where Alibaba is. Quite beautiful if you have a chance to go there. Here's their proposed kind of draws, you know, architectural plan, the city planner's plan for kind of what Hangzhou is going to look like. And you might say, wow, that's what everybody in economic development kind of wants, right? But sort of, you might also be good to say, well, is that likely to occur and look like that? That's probably the clearest day ever in China, okay? Right? And also, what does that mean in terms of being an innovative powerhouse? So what do I think you should vote? I think you should vote no. The main reason I think you should vote no is for all the excellent reasons that Daniele explained, okay? But for a moment, assume that against our broader expectations, China's able to not just go to the level that Ram talked about in terms of those inputs, but they're able to continue adding people and money, right? So we're able to continue the inputs part of a growing STEM workforce and increase spending on R&D. Moreover, we're able to diversify a bit away from manufacturing. That's a great area of debate. Let's imagine that some of that happens. Let's give them that. And moreover, that somehow, and let's be clear, this would be good, I think, for China and the world, that somehow China is able to successfully and peacefully transition to a democratic and open society with no disruption. Okay. You have to believe all that to vote yes, by the way, okay? But in addition, you should still vote no, okay? And I would argue that sort of three things matter here. One, because we actually do think that innovation systems matter. Second, because the nature of innovation is changing and that global collaboration and mobility matter. And finally, because comparative advantage matters. Essentially, and I'm sure I'll run out of time, it may be true, and I do not doubt, that specific Chinese regions and industries may emerge as meaningful global innovators. We even see some of that. But that does not mean that's a very long way from being the leading innovative power. Voting yes on this proposition means voting no on Silicon Valley, Israel, Germans manufacturing, Italian design, etc., etc. And I think that's a very, very high bar to get over. So, when we think about kind of the role of innovative capacity and entrepreneurial capacity in shaping entrepreneurial ecosystems, one of the things we think is it's not just about how many STEM workers you have or how many R&D inputs you have. The things like infrastructure matter, and policy matters, and institutions matter, and incentives matter, right? And they matter in subtle ways, right? So just for example, don't doubt that there's just, right, and I participate in some of this in some collaborations with Tsinghua, with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. There's wonderful growth in the Chinese academic infrastructure. But is that doing the kind of exploratory, risky research that we think is pretty fundamental to most meaningful, top, truly world-class innovation systems? How can we encourage costly investments towards the commercialization of new technology? So where is that effort going? And then how do we develop an environment that encourages and rewards an open, transparent, and cumulative innovation environment? So some of you know my work by my colleague Pierre Azoulay, who sort of, I think, really kind of, has a very beautiful study that really shows the sense in which even for given sets of people, incentives really matter, even for people who are working quite hard. So what he does is he compares along with Josh Kraft-Zivin and Gustavo Bumanso, and I couldn't find their photos on the internet while I was on my flight, but Pierre I happen to have on my hard drive, so there he is. But, right, if you look at, for example, the R01 program at the NIH compared to the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator Program, look at this. This is really, this is trying to get me. Okay, very good, okay, right? To the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator Program, the key is that the Howard Hughes program basically is investing in people over a 10-year period at least, where the NIH is kind of much more like the dominant mode for academic research in China, still, in fact, academic research in general, kind of 2 or 3 year grants, right? And what they show is that for the real breakthroughs, right, basically they find a sample of people who kind of get and, sort of get and don't get this kind of, kind of Howard Hughes Medical Investigator grant. And what you get is a real big divergence over a long period of time in the development of real breakthroughs. And the question is that kind of open, a real commitment to, kind of a long-term career choice, right, going to be something that we see within the Chinese innovation system? Currently, we don't see that. There are essentially 0 programs that have the kind of Howard Hughes kind of commitment to long-term researchers. In fact, the Chinese innovation system is characterized by a large number of 5-year initiatives, and every 5 years, everybody knows they have to kind of re-optimize their career quite significantly because a new government comes in, there's a new flavor of the month. Okay. Second, I'll be very, very brief on this in my short time. There's a big debate about kind of whether or not intellectual property rights, good, bad, evil, whatever. We've had other debates about that, in fact, in this room, right? But I do think that it's fair to say that while some U.S. manufacturers and European manufacturers will have plants in China, have R&D centers in China, and if you go on the tour to China, you will go to the same 5 R&D centers. You will go to the Google building, and then you'll be shuttled off to Microsoft, and then you'll go to the GE plant and the GM plant. I guarantee you that will be your tour, okay? Right? But, right, you have a situation, I've sort of missed by one here. This is China over here, that's Thailand, okay? Right? But you have a situation where, for this is the piracy rate of Windows 7 in China, okay? And what you can see here is that the piracy rate is about 60%. And basically, companies like Microsoft, though they do have a certain investment in China, are just not going to basically, and they're very upfront about that. When they see these kinds of numbers, they basically dead stop. We're not going to do major investment in figuring out how to adapt operating systems for China in the presence of the fact that basically almost everybody is ripping off our software. And it's, once again, I don't want to sort of go too deeply into this number right now, but I do think it's worthwhile to understand that corruption, that is driven more by not so much pricing or income, but things like corruption and lack of good governance. Okay? And thirdly, I think it's fair to say that one of the kind of highlights of any, the scholarly research in this room would suggest that kind of one thing that we really care about is the development of open and cumulative innovation systems, right? But when you think about it, when you think about all the examples that were given, there was no real example of the kind of infrastructure and norms and institutions that characterize a kind of cumulative process that allows particular geographies to develop workforces that then accumulate over time and build on that knowledge in a globally leading fashion over a long period of time. Right? That's something that's very, very true in places like Silicon Valley and more generally around the United States. It's actually true in lots of pockets of industrial and research and innovation expertise in Europe. It is much, much less true today in China. Okay. There was, always some Isaac Newton, can't do your bad, right? Okay. So, okay. Okay. Second part, collaboration. I'm going to go much quicker. So it's even worse than that, because if you're a researcher in China right now, you face actually a very fundamental trade-off. And this is actually a very nice paper by Ben Jones, kind of highlights these ideas. But basically, you face the trade-off of being the big fish in the Chinese pond, sort of covering a lot of topics, maybe getting your PhD at a Chinese university, publishing in the Chinese journals, or becoming a specialist and being somehow kind of part of the global scientific and research frontier. But you can't be both. Right? That's a basic fundamental investment choice about how you would educate yourself as an innovator. And there's real trade-offs between basically people in less developed countries being generalists versus people in advanced economies being specialists. Interestingly, and this is from a new paper by Richard Freeman, right? Basically what China seems to have embarked upon over the past decade, that's very consistent with Ram's numbers, but sort of kind of speaking to this, is the idea that yes, China is getting into this game, but it's mostly through co-authorships with the United States. And that actually changes once you recognize that a very significant share of all Chinese publications are basically through collaborations with international collaborators, in which they're doing a specialized piece of expertise. The kind of it's not much less zero sum, and secondly, it's much less about it's unclear how you translate the inputs into those academic publications into kind of what we would call that innovation powerhouse, i.e. at the expense of those other regions. Okay? Rather than becoming a unitary innovation powerhouse, it's much more likely that Chinese researchers and innovators will choose to become kind of global innovation agents, probably first order effect through immigration, and then secondly through collaboration. And both of those, while very important processes to study, very important for innovation outcomes, very likely to undermine some of this argument. Okay? Last part, just comparative advantage still matters. We actually have run this experiment. It's called Taiwan. Okay? They're also named China, just a different version. I know I'm out. Okay, I'll give 20 more seconds. Okay? Key insight, though, Taiwan, super innovative. They're innovation island in one thing. Because let's face it, right? Innovation-driven comparative advantage in semiconductors doesn't necessarily translate and shouldn't translate into more general innovation powerhouse across all domains. Essentially, saying yes to this motion means taking a big bet that some region in China is going to outdo all of these regions and so on and so on and so forth, and add India to that, add various regions in Europe to that, so on and so forth. So I'm going to leave it at that since I'm out of time, and basically China is not likely to become the leading innovation powerhouse by 2040. Thanks. Great.
Well done. So, apparently, we have seen at the beginning of the debate there was a rather consensus of the fact that China is not going to become the leading innovative power within 25 years. The question that many of us will ask is, who will become the innovative power within 25 years? And I think that the question is somehow wrong. And I think that Scott has shown it why. Because, we know that in the past, we always had some places, some locations, and some countries which were the leading innovators. And often the leading innovators were also those driving the economy. The British Industrial Revolution was associated to the fact that the core innovations were occurring within Great Britain. If Italy was the leading country in the Renaissance, was also because some of the leading innovations were developed in Italy. When the United States took over the leadership, they took the leadership not just because they had a larger manufacturing basis, but also because it was able to sustain the manufacturing basis with innovations. And it is automatic to think that the future will be like that. And that therefore we need to identify one single state which is likely to be the leader in innovation within 25 years. I think this is wrong. And when I say that China will not become the leading innovative power, as the motion says, it's not because I believe that the United States will continue to be the leading innovative power, or because the leadership will go back to Europe, or because Japan will take the leadership, but because I think that it's more likely that we will have a world multipolar in which countries will become less relevant as political units, in which political units within countries or across countries, including multinational corporations, will become more important, and the agreements and disagreements will be across political units and not just between political units. In this world, I think that China will definitely play a very important role because it has skills, it has now capital, it has population, but I don't think that China will be able to become a leader by itself. And it's more likely that in a variety of areas, China will collaborate with other countries and with other innovative centers.
Okay, thanks for my colleagues for substantial numbers. I want to point out three things. So it seems all my colleagues, well, especially Scott and Daniel, pointed out those numbers. I feel you're talking about inventions rather than innovations. Innovations are not entirely about originality. Innovation is the act to transform something novel into something useful, something applicable. So innovation in that sense is the interaction between technology and humans. And in China, we do have a lot of humans. So the second point I want to talk about is when I was in China working at Tsinghua, and we do have a big group of people coming from overseas, and our dean asked us, what did you learn in the US, in Australia, in the UK? We came to the conclusion that, the secret recipe for the US success is actually the marriage between technology and capital. So that's the marriage between Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And therefore, China is building very strong capability on that front. I can tell you, in 2005, China only got 500 VC venture capital and private and equity firms. And last year, China had 10,000. So altogether, China perhaps now has $100 billion in stock in VC and PE investment. So what they're looking for investment opportunities. They are trying to transform something novel, some novel ideas into applications. So in the US, all those startup firms, they started in their parents' garages. And of course, we don't have garages in China. So in Beijing, there is a street, and you can go there. That is called Entrepreneurship Street. And there's a coffee shop called Garage Cafe. And there you can basically imitate all those activities, those Google's founders and Facebook founders, they started. So that is a place where capital and technology can get married. That is the recipe China has learned, and that needs time for that productivity, creativity to release. I believe in 25 years, China will catch up. And the third one I want to point out, that is actually in the past 30 years, China has learned a lot from foreign direct investment, thanks to them. And actually today, there are about 25 to 30% of R&D outputs actually from those foreign invested companies. And those companies are investing in China not just to exploit cheap labors anymore. They are there to take advantages of Chinese talent. And China produced about 7 million university graduates last year, and most of them in science engineers. And those people will contribute to both domestic and multinational firms in the long run. I think that's all. Thank you.
Very excellent. Okay. I feel like I was just here. Okay. So I do think, I just want to build on the discussion that we've been having, and I think maybe just add two key points that I think Daniela kind of brought up to begin with, but I think are really important. And one is the role of democracy, and the other is the role of aging. So let me start with the latter one first, because I know the facts about that better. So the most important challenge that China currently faces is that due to other things as well, but certainly due to the one-child policy, it has the extreme form of the rapid aging that almost every Western economy is about to go through, including clearly the Northern European economies. As Daniela, I think, sort of said very quickly, but I don't think you were running out of time, so I'm just expanding on this point. That one fact means that, for example, if you look to 2040, the population of youth who will be eligible to be in that kind of fertile innovator workforce in India is much, I'm not sure if it's much larger, but is certainly larger than China. And eventually, I don't know when the date is, India's population is anticipated to, in fact, outgrow China's. The other part of that is that as the current generation of Chinese and of China ages, that is going to put tremendous stress on the fiscal, both the government and also the private savings. So yes, there's tremendous capital being poured into China, and there's also tremendous capital resident in China. But that's because all those people are saving, and that dissaving process is going to be an inherent drag on exactly the kind of technology capital formation that Marina was alluding to. The last part of it that I would say is that, once again, interestingly, I think that both Daniela and I would be delighted to see the basic preconditions for Chinese innovative success to come true, because in particular, that would mean that China had liberalized its political system. But interestingly, there seems to be relatively little movement towards that. And I think that you would really have to be making a bet, and I think one that is quite idiosyncratic, of the, we know from the history of the Soviet Union, we know from histories of other countries, there is a, there's got to be a tax, and a significant tax on innovation in political environments in which people do not have the freedom of expression and the freedom of movement. Okay, thanks.
Since this is the only working one, it's
It's on, right? Thanks. Can I just...
You have your rebuttal slides all ready to go. That's cheating. No, it's not cheating because I did that the last time.
Okay. I'd like to first of all congratulate our opponents for rephrasing the debate, because the deck's already stacked against us. I think we had like 80% in favor of them in the first place. Now they want to say that it's not China's going to be the leader, but China is going to be one of the leaders. Well, I think we're gonna go with that. We're gonna go with that, and we would say that if you believe what Daniele just told you, that you should vote for us. Because if China is going to be one of the joint leaders, it will be very akin to. But let me make just 3 points. First of all, I think our opponents are a lot of what our opponents are telling us is focused on. It's very much colored by status quo bias. China, they're telling us lots of things about China today versus China tomorrow. And one thing we know about the world economy is that it's changing faster today than it ever has in history. And 25 years is a long time. So lots of things can happen in that period. If you look at the patent applicant forecast, for example, just in the very near future, we see that China is going to become the leading patenter in terms of WIPO over all other innovative economies. The second thing to bear in mind is, I think Daniele mentioned, and Scott also mentioned this, that innovation, that there are some innovative parts of China, but really lots of China is not very innovative. Well, that's fine, but the U.S. is the same thing is true for the U.S. Richard Florida has told us that innovation systems are very spiky. I mean, our data shows, for example, that Silicon Valley, San Jose, San Francisco account for 25% of U.S. patent output. Okay, that's one teeny little part of the U.S. So why should we worry? Just one teeny part of China could become world dominant, just like nobody's questioning Silicon Valley, right? That's a quarter of the U.S. innovative system, if you think about it in some ways. Okay, the second thing I'd like to point out is that this transition we're talking about is a transition from imitation to innovation. Okay, so everything we see today in China is, and our opponents have been pointing to this again and again, and we would concede that a lot of what's happening in China today is imitative processes. But we've been here before. I mean, everybody in the 60s and 70s, people said Japan would never become innovative. They just keep copying what we do. In the 90s, people said Korea would never be innovative. They just keep copying what's done in the West. And certainly in the case of Japan, I think most people concede that Japan today is a leading innovative economy. And Korea is changing people's minds. Slowly but surely, people are thinking, well, hang on a second, maybe stuff is going on in Korea too. So clearly what's happening in China is a lot of collaboration with the West, absolutely no doubt about that. But today, China being a junior partner today doesn't mean that they're always going to be a junior partner. And if we look at, I'll close by saying, just asking you one thing. In this audience, we're in Europe after all, who is the leading innovator in the world economy today? Is it the US or Europe? And you would sensibly say to me, as innovation scholars, that, well, in some sectors, the US is the leader. In other sectors, Europe is the leader. Overall, well, I don't know. You could show me some numbers that show Europe is ahead. I could show you other numbers that show the US is ahead. And I would argue that we're likely to see the same thing in China. By 2040, we're likely to see some numbers which will show China to be ahead, relatively, in a very high level. And some numbers that show China will be not so far ahead, exactly as Daniele pointed out. And that means you should vote for us. Thank you.
Time for questions from the audience. So we have one there first in the middle. We have mics.
Thank you for your presentation. So we talk a lot about technology, patents, industry, manufacturing, a little bit about capital, and we're forgetting the human aspect and the mobility. Scott Stern barely touched about mobility. And you start thinking of a region, you might wonder is Silicon Valley innovative because the California education system is really doing well? Or it's because it's able to attract talent all over the world? And if you think about mobility and people flows, then you start thinking about China, whether it's going to be able to attract people in the same degrees as the US or other European countries are attracting. And then you start thinking about the cultural norms, the language, how easy it is for a foreigner to start a business there, get into their tight networks, deal with politics that they don't know. Whereas relocating to the US is pretty much plug and play, right? We have Western people more or less have the drivers to thrive in that environment. So maybe the mobility aspect and the people flows, it's what's been left out of the picture. And that might explain, maybe that's my bias, but I don't know, I would like to hear about that, why China might find it very difficult to become an innovative powerhouse in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, just respond.
My name is Lily Wang from UNU Merit to Netherlands. I agree that in China, we have lots of problems like pollution, aging, and corruption, and so on. But here I would like to add 4 points from the output side. First, traditionally, people would think that China's growth is mainly from manufacturing or structural change. Actually, when you look at the GDP growth, when you decompose the GDP growth, actually you would find that in the early stage, it is true mainly from the structural change or efficiency change and so on. But in the later stage, near to 2000, actually it's a totally different story. The major contribution to the GDP growth comes from the technological progress, mainly from technology. And secondly, as to the output, we normally use patent or publications to measure the innovation output. And here we have the complete picture with China database as well. I would like to point out that most of the time when we see literature talking about patenting in China, actually people look at only 2% of the total patents in China. Because it's very interesting that Chinese inventors, they do not file their inventions outside of China. Only 2% they file outside in, for instance, like EPO, PTO, and so on. So mostly some researchers, if they look at only EPO or PTO, they look at only 2% of the total patents. And now...
okay, let's, I mean, we cannot have more interventions.
Sorry, I will quickly. And then talking about the quality, because people would say that this is only the quantity. But talking about the quality, actually, lots of people also criticizing that the output of research of technology in China is very low. The quality is very low. Actually, if you look at the citation, yes, it is low because China, we don't have so many reputed researchers from in the history. So the citation rate is very low. But if you look at the
we simply need to stop now and allow the panel to respond to these two interventions. So please.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so let me just build on the mobility point, if that's okay. I mean, I'm not sure. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think that that's exactly right. And I have to admit, I had a whole set of slides on there around that, and I just didn't get to them. But I think that that's actually quite important, is to recognize that even Marina herself has moved from Tsinghua into Australia. I think that the fact is that what you see very high ability entrepreneurs and innovators do in terms of that emigration and that kind of really sort of figuring out where they're going to sort of stake their careers is extremely important. And I think that it's fair to say that at this point, the trickle of absorption into China by innovators is still very, very small. It's for entrepreneurs, it's bigger. And for capital, people in business of various types, we have lots of students, from leading business schools who go off to China to sort of seek their fortune, but it's still a trickle, I think, on what we would call people who would meaningfully contribute to the innovation system.
Well, I moved out of China because I have to concern my children's well-being because the pollution in Beijing was really bad. But pointing to...
which is exactly the point.
Yes. It's not for my own career development. Actually, I cry in my dreams when I think about Beijing. So I want to point out the mobility of human capital. I want to point out that, 1/3 of the mobile phones today are actually connected by China's telecom companies, ZTE and Huawei. And ZTE actually has 18 R&D centers all over the world. And they hired 26,000 R&D engineers, 10% of them are foreigners. So you do not need to go to China. You can work for Chinese firms outside of China. In fact, Huawei, instead of relying on their in-house R&D capabilities, they are now today in the position to acquire technologies. Recently, Huawei just acquired a company in the UK, which is a failed company, used to be and the BT. So Huawei is building its integrative capability to put their acquired technologies into their own patent portfolio. So that is also part of mobility and building your innovative capital.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that Marina said two things which are precisely my point. That you moved out because of social and environmental reasons, and that you can create networks which are not any longer territorially based. And these networks are not territorially based, something might be different. But I like very much the intervention by Li Wang. Assertive, brave, and with a point, which reminds me very much my times of the PhD as Peru, which I did with many others here. And at this time, by far, the best parties were the Latin American parties. Wonderful music, wonderful dancing, a lot of drinking, and give me another night like that. I remember that these parties were generally held at the faculty, and I didn't have a car, and often these parties lasted on Friday or Saturday night until the morning after. And at the morning after, it was difficult to go to get the bus. At the first bus, morning bus, was at 8 o'clock. And because we were a bit drunk, and therefore some of us were used to walk on our four legs to reach the bus station. As soon as we reached the bus station, some students were coming down to work on Sunday morning. And of course, not the Latin American students. They were the Chinese students. When I saw these sort of things, I really start to think that indeed there is a potential for Chinese growth. 25 years have passed since then. And I'm not surprised that today we are discussing about the Chinese innovative power and not the Latin American power. Because these students working on Sunday morning at 8 o'clock were those who very much made Chinese economic growth. But still, I think that the future will not see us with a single strong Chinese innovative power. Thank you anyhow.
We have a final question from Henry Salman. All right, we have that question and then you go.
It's actually really a question, so you get a chance to speak to it. So I think the question or the motion is framed as levels of output, right? Who's going to produce the most innovations? I mean, that's interpreted that way. And I think if you think of levels as inputs times efficiency, I think there's little disagreement that the levels of inputs are going to be really, really high. Numbers of people, numbers of dollars. So I think it comes down to who's going to be more efficient. And I think that's where kind of Scott's point comes in of institutions. So right now it looks like institutions are not as good as in other regions of the world to produce innovations. The question is, can China change its institutions in 25 years to get to the level that the efficiency of innovation production gets up? And maybe it's democracy, but maybe actually they're able to discouple democracy from patent systems, from all those kinds of things. And it's partly a question. What do you think about, if you assume that institution is what's driving it or not, can they change, and what are some of the tensions that they maybe experience? Because that's, to me, seems to be the deciding factor.
Let me take a shot. First of all, I guess the first two questions. The human aspect, I think, is extremely important. Obviously, I'm a complete believer in that. And if we consider the human aspect of the leading innovative powerhouse of the United States economy, we see that the largest contributor to Silicon Valley is Taiwan and China. The second largest contributor to Silicon Valley is India. So I would put it to you that actually this is not evidence of strength. This is evidence of weakness. And the U.S. innovative system is actually extremely dependent on imported talent, mainly because the homegrown talent is pretty poor. So, and this talent is coming, a huge percentage of this talent is coming from China. Now, these people come from China, and I would ask you to believe, and hopefully you would agree, that they don't immediately cut themselves off and become isolated from their home economy. We have global innovation networks which are increasingly thickening their connections to China, with the leading centers of the world. We certainly see this. I mean, I don't claim to be a huge expert on China per se, but certainly in a great deal of field work in Bangalore, we see this. The connection in Bangalore and Silicon Valley between the Indian diaspora are contributing enormously to the strength of the Indian innovative system. And there's no reason to expect this would not be true for China. The second aspect I'd like you to bear in mind here is that if you look at Korea, there's a tremendously inward-looking innovative system, but one which has caught up tremendously fast. And so there's no reason to expect that just being inward-looking or being reliant on your own diaspora, with the Korean catch-up is very much a story of relying on the Korean diaspora. There's no reason to expect that China, many times larger, relying on the larger Chinese diaspora, could not rapidly catch up. And ultimately, the issue is once you catch up, one would expect that imitative processes would transition into innovative processes. But there's some technical details with regard to the U.S., the Chinese patents, and I think I showed you in my presentation that the foreign patents of China are rising very rapidly. Finally, I'd like to welcome Daniele to our team by his story of Sprue. I mean, obviously, as you can see, his stories of the Chinese graduate students, I think, is clearly indication of what the future holds. Thanks.
Thank you. So that will be the last word of this debate because of the next parallel sessions and because of the coffee break in between. We need to do the final thing on this debate, and that would be to have the final vote. So again, let it be resolved that this conference, in the meantime I corrected the missing this, believes that China will become the leading innovative power in the world 2040. Those who vote for the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. And those who vote against the motion, please raise your hand. More people got an opinion. So we have now a half an hour lunch break, but at 4:45, the parallel sessions will begin in various rooms. Thank you.